Well, hello, and welcome back to Read Becca. Today we're going to do something like an unhaul, about the closest I will get to an unhaul, generally. You see, I have hundreds of unread books in my collection, and my general practice is that most of the books that I read, I'm not intending to reread, they're not new favorites. So if they're not from an author that I am specifically collecting that author's books, or it's a new favorite, they leave my collection immediately after I've read them. And that's fine, that doesn't mean they were bad. I just want to free up more space for new books. So that's my general practice, so I'm not collecting things to unhaul, in most cases. However, I do have a yearly set TBR shelf, and that shelf, it's actually 4 shelves on a Billy bookcase, but that shelf is static for the entire year, and nothing comes or goes off of that shelf. However, at the end of the year, I turn over that shelf, taking off the books only that I have read in order to make room for the new books. So basically, I'm allowing myself the space based on what I did the previous year. Everything else that I didn't read stays the same. And in 2024, I didn't do very well on reading from that shelf. I only read 11 things, though I did great. If you've seen my goals video reading from my own shelves, I read 65 books, just not from the specific TBR, which is probably telling me that my prioritization was not quite right, or really they were in front of me all the time, and so I just never chose to get to them because they were always right there. However, we're going to go through those 11 books and decide whether I enjoyed them enough that I want them to stay in my collection or they're going to leave. So let's dive into the 11 books. The first book that I read from the pile is The Uncommon Reader by Ellen Bennett, and this is such a tiny, delightful slip of a book that it's definitely staying in my collection, and I could see rereading it. We're following the Queen of England as she, late in life, discovers a joy of reading, how that changes her internally, and also the external perceptions of her changing over that, and I enjoyed it very much. The second book from the stack that I read is A Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy Toole, and this one I'm happy to say will definitely be leaving my collection. I think I'm glad to have read this, though I didn't really like it as a book. It's such an important, or not important, but it's such a cultural zeitgeist book. It won the Pulitzer. It has almost a mythos surrounding the publication of the book. And I think that I was very intrigued and interested by the main character's depiction, Ignatius, as this very, very non-neurotypical person, though there wouldn't have been really terminology for that at the time, and that wasn't well depicted at the time. He's very abrasive and extremely, extremely unlikable. Really, everyone in this book is unlikable, and it's known to be humorous, but the sense of humor fell very flat for me. It is that kind of extremely unkind humor that is punching down at everyone around, and just everyone is very unkind to one another as well. So I think this book was just not for me, though I am glad to have experienced it, I guess. The third book is Nella Larsen's Passing, and this will definitely be staying in my collection. It's a short one. I could see rereading it. This is the story of 2 women who were childhood friends that have reconnected in adulthood, and one of them has been living as white passing to the title, while both of them are women of color. And so it almost verges into like suspense and thriller. There's so much tension and jealousy between these women. And that tension is maintained while also really exploring a character-focused story. And so yeah, I could absolutely see rereading this and want to hang on to it. The next one was Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. I embarked on reading this because so many people had recommended it to me, and I guess you can tell it was a success because I bought a bunch of Octavia Butler down here. So I definitely will be keeping this in my collection. This is kind of sci-fi, very light on that element, though. It's much more about exploring social commentary through a speculative lens. We have a woman from relatively modern day who is Black that's getting pulled back into the American South at times of threat to a young white boy who is somewhat important to her in some way back in history. And so she's getting pulled back in time to this time when she is in danger. She's enslaved person, basically. And so it's exploring that and very much more, like the complexities of that. So I think this was a really smart book. that I could absolutely find more in from rereading, and definitely want to continue on with Octavia Butler. I do think, in terms of keeping this in my collection, I don't particularly love this edition. I mean, it's fine, but I think I will probably keep an eye out for a different copy of this, or a decent hardback. Definitely secondhand though, unless something really nice comes up in terms of new publications. But yeah, I think this copy might leave my collection, but I do want to have the book Kindred in my collection. The next one is Life on Other Planets, a memoir of finding my place in the universe by Aomawa Shields. And I actually got to see Dr. Aomawa speak in person at my local science center, and this is her memoir talking about her history really as someone who was very math and science focused growing up, but always felt left out of that space really as a person of color and a woman. And so she left the field entirely in college. She dropped out and went into acting, had a somewhat successful acting career, and then found her way back, and now is a NASA astrobiologist. So this was a fantastic memoir, and I do definitely want to hang on to it, because this is one of those just really powerful memoirs that not only focuses on her as a person, but also she really holds a lot of space for the other people, specifically women, who influenced her. So it has so much, I guess, asides discussing other women in science who were really powerful and strong forerunners in their fields. So loved this memoir. And then we have The Center Cannot Hold, My Journey Through Madness by Ellen R. Sachs. This also really powerful, also a personal account of Sachs' experience all the way from childhood as she was going through mental disorder, effectively, very profoundly. And this is so compelling to read. It's kind of unputdownable. And you are watching these breaks in reality that from childhood often were sort of dismissed by people around her as just sort of her being a whimsical child, you know, not quite in touch with reality, and that not being viewed as a problem in the ways that it became later on as she headed into college, and it started affecting her ability to function in reality. And it is very, very harrowing to read. So I'm a little bit torn on this one because I enjoyed this so much. I think this was really compelling to read, but I don't see myself rereading it. So I don't know if this needs to stay in my collection. I think this is going on a maybe pile. Next one we have is Bar Harbor, Retirement Home for Famous Writers and Their Muses by Terry Lynn DeFino. And I enjoyed this, but it's going to be leaving because I don't see rereading it, and it was fine. It was enjoyable. I enjoyed my time with it. It's in Bar Harbor, so you're getting very New England vibes. You're at a retirement home with elderly writers who are winding down their lives, and you're dealing with that through both their eyes and also one of their caregivers' eyes, who lives at this retirement home as well, has some trauma in her past she's dealing with, and then her favorite author comes to stay, who is kind of an enigma, but also a very big personality, and the interactions between them. And of course, there are major bookish elements to this. So there was a lot to enjoy here, but it's not a new favorite, so it's definitely leaving. Next, I have Half an Inch of Water by Percival Everett. And this was my first exposure to Everett's writing, though he is everywhere on BookTube, but not for this particular work. And this is a collection of short stories that are centering contemporary American West and seem to be in a collected or shared community somewhere in Wyoming. So there's a wide variety of types of stories in here as well, even though they seem to be in a shared setting. We have everything ranging from kind of the hardships of rural small town life in a very grounded way to kind of speculative stories to full-on horror, I would say. So there's a really good range, and it definitely sold me on absolutely wanting to read more of his work. I also just kind of like this little book, but it wasn't a new favorite. There weren't any real strong stories that I hated, but there weren't any that I absolutely loved. They did tell me that from what I've heard of other books, those books will probably be from me based on what I found here. So I feel like I should get rid of this because I'm not going to reread it and it wasn't a favorite, but I also just kind of like the book. And I do think I will like Percival Everett continuing on. So I'm a little torn, but I think this one's leaving probably. The next one is Wicked by Gregory Maguire. I had impeccable timing in finally getting to this the year before the movie came out. So that worked out well. I have seen the musical half a dozen times in person and absolutely love it. Both are ostensibly the story of the Wicked Witch from Oz, but this is a different beast entirely. This is so wildly different from the much pared down and simplified, happy-fied version that is on the stage and screen. So this is a much more complex book. It's much more grim, and it dives into the eerie and dark aspects that the movie only barely touches on. Like, those are kind of the main focus of this book. Also 100% more orgies in here. This is not a family-friendly book at all. However, I enjoyed it a ton. You have to be willing to embrace the absurd, definitely, for this, because I feel like, and I think I said this when I was talking about it the first time around when I reviewed it, it really feels that McGuire loves the source material and is embracing the absurdism, and in his delivery here is going for both pastiche out of that love and also satire. He is capable of making it an over-the-top version of Oz, even as absurd as Oz is, while also poking fun at it and making fun of it. So he managed to do both things in a really great way, I think. Though I don't know that I caught everything in here because it goes so many places. It is wildly all over the place. So this one will definitely be staying in my collection. I loved it. And I have more of the books in the series to continue on with this year. Then we have another series book, and that is Mossflower by Brian Jacques. And this is the sequel to Redwall, or this is a prequel, really, to Redwall, second book in the series. And this series is very simple in that it's intended for children, but it's not simply written. It's very rich in the sense of place and scenery and heavy descriptions of food, lots of bard song. I was listening to part of this on audio, and breaking into song happens very, very often. But it also has that kind of very on-the-nose morality where you have the mice who live in the abbey and they are very, very good, and then the bad guys live in the forest and they are rats and weasels, that sort of thing. So it's very simplistic in that aspect. But I've enjoyed this very much. It's heavy on adventure, and I think that's the prominent thing, where it's not quite high fantasy. It's much more an adventure fantasy story with short bursts of action and conflict, skirmishes that are constantly ongoing between the good and bad guys that don't really seem to ever lead anywhere, but it's just enjoyable to follow them. So this particular entry was not a real standout, and I don't think I would reread it, but I am trying to read through and collect the whole series because it is such an enjoyable series to read. So I think this one is staying on my shelves because I'm collecting the series, though it will not be a standout or one I will reread. And finally, probably the last and least known book that I read is Miranda in Milan by Catherine Duckett. This one I enjoyed a ton and knew very little about The Tempest going into this, but this is inspired by Shakespeare's Tempest. I read this in conjunction with watching the play, and that gave me such a rich experience with reading this that I do think I want to hang on to the book, because it's a short novella. It's very uncommon. I've not seen anybody else who's read it. So I don't want to sort of let it go and then not be able to get a hold of it again. And this continues Miranda's story, who is a side character in The Tempest, after the end of The Tempest. And I feel like the exploration here enriched so many things, because it isn't just exploring her, it's also got her development as an independent character and woman, which she didn't have a lot of independence in The Tempest, questioning things from The Tempest, and then also developing as a person in her own right, where she has sort of a romance, but she realizes the naivety that was happening with that in The Tempest. And so now she's forging ahead, moving forward from that, and there's kind of a sapphic element to this one. So yeah, this one I enjoyed very much and do want to keep on my shelves. So those are the books. I guess 3 and a maybe out of 11 is a pretty good ratio for getting rid of versus keeping, and tells me, even though I didn't read a majority of books on my TBR shelf, most of the ones that I read were books I really, really enjoyed and were there for a reason, and were paring down much less of a percentage than I would have expected based on my usual reading. So I think that's a decent ratio, really. So that is it for my will they stay or will they go. I hope you enjoyed seeing my rationale on what I keep versus what leaves my shelves, and thank you so very much for watching.